Hello everyone, welcome to the webinars brought to you by State Farm and Safe Kids. Today, Safely Transporting Children by Ambulance. So we have two wonderful speakers that are going to be sharing a lot of wonderful information with you. You will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the webinar. We also are going to be recording this, so this will be available later on the CPS board website. And to get a CEU from that recording, there will be some questions that you will need to have. So there also will be a follow-up email that will be given automatically within an hour of closing the webinar that will go to each of you that have participated. And you will also be getting a number of resource links in that follow-up email that I think you will find very, very helpful. So what we're going to do is just advance the slide and talk to you about if you are watching with friends and you are the organizer, you can, if you haven't registered, you can still take part into a group. Just have a sign-in sheet, enter the CEU as an in-person update, and keep a copy of the sign-in sheet in case you are CEU audited. So that will create a nice opportunity for people who haven't been able to join us today, and we will be able to still provide you with some wonderful information. So the objectives of today, I'm not going to read each of these, but primarily this is an issue that confronts us in many different ways when we're in occupant protection. We'll be talking about some of the barriers that are unique to transporting children in ambulances, discussing best practice recommendations. We'll also be talking about some of the car seats and stretcher restraints that have been recommended. We'll also be looking at training curriculum for safe transportation and also discussing some of the standards and testing that is required in this system. So on the call today, we have Kevin Gallagher. Kevin looks very serious in this picture here. Maybe it's because he's so secured in this ambulance vest. He is Vice President of Sales and Marketing of Serenity Safety Products and is National Registry Paramedic. He has been an EMS provider and educator for 35 years and has also been child passenger safety technician trained. We also have on the call today Michelle Chapello, who is an RN and a child passenger safety technician instructor. She is with the Riley Hospital for Children and is the CPS program coordinator there, and also is an instructor for the Safe Travel for All Children. So they would also like to acknowledge many of the people that are listed in this acknowledgement slide that have been very active and continue to be active in making sure that every possibility and every agency that can contribute to the safety of transporting children in ambulances, we make that possible. There will be a PDF of the slides that will follow in the follow-up email as well. So at this point, Kevin, I'd like to have you just jump right in here and you can start this off.
All right, Kim, thank you very much. I'm going to start with discussing the ambulance environment and the challenges that it presents to safely transporting children. So some of you on the call may be very familiar with EMS and may be involved in it actively. Many of you may not be. So we're going to run through some things that affect transporting children in the back of the ambulance vehicle. The first thing is EMS as a healthcare profession is very, very new and it evolved very rapidly. In a short period of time, we went from transporting patients in a funeral home hearse and just basically throwing them in the back and speeding to the hospital to providing a very high level of advanced life support on the scene using a variety of pharmaceuticals, resuscitation devices, and other equipment. In the course of this evolution, ambulances have struggled to keep up. We started off with vehicles that were primarily designed for passenger transport, kind of like this old van you see on the left here. And modern ambulances in the USA now consist typically of modular vehicles that are built on big truck chassis with boxes that are specially designed on the back to allow us to work on the patients and house all the equipment we need. As that evolution has taken place, very little attention has been paid until recently to exactly what happens to these commercial vehicles when we adapt them for ambulance use. So we haven't really kept up with standards and testing. Another reason that's kind of fallen through the cracks is that compared to passenger vehicles that get most of the attention, there's far fewer crashes in ambulances. Next slide, please. So here's some facts and figures on that. According to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, there are about 4,500 ambulance crashes annually, and of those crashes, about 2,600 involve injuries and 33 fatalities. According to a separate study by the Centers for Disease Control, over 79% of ambulance crashes are from the front of the vehicle. That's important to those of us that are involved in passenger safety in ambulances because it gives us a pretty good idea of what direction the impact is going to be coming from and what we have to do to protect the occupant. There hasn't been a lot of studies done on pediatric patients in ambulance crashes, but what there has shows that there's about 1,000 per year. Next slide, please. So some of this may seem kind of obvious, but it's important to really focus on the fact that ambulances are not the same as passenger vehicles. And for those of you on the call that are trained as child passenger safety technicians, you have to accept the fact that a lot of what we were taught for safely installing and transporting child restraints in passenger vehicles may not apply in the different environment that the ambulance represents. So obviously they're different size and they're also a very different weight. The average ambulance in the US is about 3 times the weight of the average passenger vehicle. They're also made very differently. Your passenger car is designed as a unit with occupant safety integrated into that, crash tested as a unit by whatever the manufacturer of the vehicle is. Most of the vehicles we use in emergency medicine are truck chassis. They're designed for commercial use. And then the company that manufactures them, might be Ford, General Motors, or whoever, gives those to the ambulance manufacturer, and then the ambulance manufacturer builds some kind of a box on the back that is the passenger compartment. So they install the seating and everything else. So the vehicles aren't built or crash tested as a unit. And also, each ambulance manufacturer has their own way of doing things. They may use wood in some cases, another may use aluminum for the cabinets inside. It's really different, and there's a lot less consistency than you find in a passenger vehicle. These things add up to very different behavior in a crash than you get with a vehicle designed as an integrated unit. And one of the things we found as we've developed new crash testing pulses for ambulances is that there's actually 2 impacts. So if you look at the modular vehicles on the left and right of this picture, when they hit an object, there's a collision when the front of the vehicle strikes it, and then as the deceleration begins, that box on the back actually hits the back of the front compartment, the driver's compartment, and creates a secondary impact. And the forces involved are also quite a bit more violent as far as G's in a passenger car crash. There's also different rules that these vehicles operate under as opposed to a passenger car. The Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards that apply to all vehicles don't really apply to purpose-built commercial vehicles that are designed as a work truck and back. So the same rules that apply to a passenger car would apply to the front of these vehicles where the driver and the other occupants sit, but once it comes to the back of it, they may not apply completely or at all. So all this conspires to yield the fact that a child restraint designed for use in a passenger car may not behave the same way in this different environment. When the engineers and the manufacturers of child restraints design their seats, they're designed for a very specific purpose to work in a passenger-sized vehicle using crash test pulses that are designed for passenger vehicles, and they're designed to go into forward-facing seats. Next slide, please. So taking a look inside the ambulance, we see some other things that are quite different than a passenger vehicle. If you look at these 2 pictures, you'll see that there's really no forward-facing seating. in the back of these two ambulances. And as I mentioned, child restraints are designed and crash tested to go in forward-facing seats. Now, we're starting to see more forward-facing seats in ambulances simply because they're safer for the adult occupant as well. But in the United States, still, the lion's share of ambulances have rear-facing or side-facing seats to facilitate working on the patient. The restraints are also a little bit different. The ambulance manufacturers buy retractors and restraint systems that are designed for passenger vehicles or passenger trucks. So they're designed for forward-facing impacts. They're tested that way. When you mount them on a side-facing seat, like you'll see in this picture on the right here, the retractors don't always behave the same way because the forces that are pulling the belt out are coming from a different direction. So sometimes they may lock up quicker, they may lock up more slowly. Other factors that affect putting child restraints in these is that they may be ELRs and they may not be switchable, so there may be no easy way to lock them to secure the child restraint. Some other things you find in the back of the ambulance is that there's a lot of sharp edges, corners, aluminum extrusions, protruding objects. All these things can be very dangerous if a patient is not restrained or any occupant is not restrained. You also find a lot of heavy equipment, oxygen tanks, defibrillators, and other devices that may not be secured while the ambulance is in operation. We're trying to work to change that, and there's new standards to try to ensure that, but there's still a lot of loose stuff flying around. And the biggest loose stuff flying around is typically the attendant. Quite often we don't wear our seat belts because it impinges on our ability to work on the patient, even though we know we should, and so sometimes you get a couple 100-pound flying objects. Next slide, please. Those of you that are child passenger safety technician trained are probably aware of the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards that are relevant to child restraints. And that's FMVSS 213. And we've been taught to look at the child restraint and see if it has some kind of a sticker like this thing on the top right that basically documents that that child restraint conforms to those standards and it's certified for use in a motor vehicle. So I'm going to take a few minutes here and talk about whether that's relevant and meaningful in a child restraint we use in an ambulance. So first I'd like to talk a little bit about what's required to actually have that sticker and say that you passed 213. There's three major things. The crash test that you conduct has to conform to a specific pulse. And by pulse, I mean that's the energy released when the test sled impacts the barrier. And that pulse is graphed as a specific graph for 213 that has to fall within certain parameters to be considered a valid test. So you have to have a 213 pulse and your test has to fall within that criteria. The device that you're testing also has to contain an anthropomorphic test device or a crash test dummy that's instrumented and is capable of generating data that can be used to formulate injury criteria. So there's head injury scoring, chest injury scoring, and other measurements that are used to determine that the injury sustained by the occupant of this seat would be acceptable under the standards of FMVSS 213. The other thing is that child restraint has to be attached to a certain type of a seat. It's called a test buck, and there's a picture of it here on the lower left. And in order to be a valid 213 test, whatever you're testing has to be attached to that buck. So all those things have to happen in order to carry one of those stickers you see at the top. So is that meaningful? And if a child restraint that you use in an ambulance does not have that, does that mean it hasn't been tested or it's an unsafe device? Well, not necessarily. And Michelle's going to talk about some specific devices later on that are integrated seats, that are an adult seat that has a child restraint built into it, or maybe it's a device designed to go on the cot to secure children. And since those devices can't be tested on this buck, they can't be said to pass 213. But they have been tested using the 213 pulse with the correct ATVs and have met the injury criteria. So the fact that they don't have the sticker doesn't necessarily mean they haven't met at least the spirit of the standard. Now, some devices marketed in the ambulance industry actually can be tested on a crash test buck, and they carry this. And if you look at the picture in the lower right, that's an inflatable car seat that is designed and marketed to EMS that has been successfully crash tested. And this is a video off the manufacturer's website here. It won't run for us today, but that shows that they have passed 213. Next slide, please. So does the fact that they've passed 213 ensure that this device is safe to use in the ambulance? Well, not necessarily. This is a copy of a page of their instructions. And if you look at the section I've highlighted in red there, it says that this device is for front-facing seats. So they have crash tested to 213, but they're telling you right in the instructions you have to use it in a front-facing seat. So if your ambulance doesn't have any front-facing seats in the back, you really can't use this device, and the fact that it's been crash tested at 213 becomes irrelevant. Now, I inserted this picture. This is off their website, but this shows their seat in a rear-facing ambulance attendant seat in the back of the passenger compartment here. So it's a little bit misleading. If I was looking at this, it would lead me to believe that this seat was safe to use in the back of the ambulance. So the moral to some of this stuff, and you'll hear more of this as we go through the presentation today, is that you've got to do due diligence on any type of child restraint. And you can't always go by what the manufacturer puts on a website. You need to actually check with them and find out, has this device been tested? If it has, to what standards, and has it been tested in the same position and way that's going to actually be used in the ambulance vehicle? Next slide, please. So I'm going to touch briefly on some of the standards that do exist for ambulances. I mentioned that FMVSS may not always apply. So the longest standing standard is called KKK, and that was originally developed by the General Services Administration just to ensure that they had consistency and a certain standard for vehicles purchased by the federal government. There was never really any intent that this would have any safety standards or be used outside of the federal government. But as time went on, because it was the only standard available, more and more people started adopting this as something that had some meaning. In 2007, NIOSH, which is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, received funding to try to produce more meaningful ambulance safety standards. And they partnered with GSA, with AMD, which is an ambulance manufacturers group, some of the major crash test facilities in the country, Ford Motor Company, and basically a lot of players involved in producing ambulances to try to develop new and improved standards. And I'll talk more about those in a slide or two. So during that time, the administration of KKK has been transitioned to NFPA. So that's the National Fire Protection Association, and they've been doing an excellent job of maintaining and updating this standard, and they've made it back into a real living document that more accurately reflects the needs of EMS. Next slide, please. So in most states, the EMS office has quite a bit to do with regulating ambulance services in that state. And amongst the requirements they typically have, there's usually equipment lists that state what has to be in an ambulance. Now, there are still quite a few states that do not require any type of child restraints. I think Michelle will give a case study a little bit later that has to do with that. And some states, in addition to their equipment lists, have actually specified that ambulances must meet KKK as well. Now, I mentioned that AMD was involved with NIOSH in developing the new crash test pulses and procedures. That's been done, and what they've decided to do, along with the other players that were in that working group, is to give those standards to a third-party agency, which is called SAE, to maintain in the future. Next slide, please. SAE is a global entity that's the International Society of Automotive Engineers, and they're a group of scientists, engineers, and interested people in vehicle technology and safety, and they're dedicated to the advancement of that. So they maintain these standards now, and they will in the future as well. So these are the new ambulance standards that were actually developed to be specific and meaningful for ambulance crash testing. So that starts with crash test pulses. So these are pulses that take into account the heavier vehicle, the fact that there's a double impact because of the box on the back, and they have standards for pulses for frontal impact as well as side impact. Next slide, please. In addition to the test pulses, there's also specific procedures that are involved in testing and certifying that different types of components inside the ambulance meet these new standards. And those are chunked up into 4 different numbers. I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but the one we're most concerned with for this talk is J3026, and that is ambulance compartment patient seating integrity and occupant restraint. So that encompasses both adult occupant safety as well as child occupant safety in the back of the ambulance. There are also standards for the ambulance cot mounts, the cot retention, and the cot restraints. There are standards for keeping equipment securely mounted in the event of a crash, and there are some specific standards for rear impacts. Next slide, please. So getting more to the specifics of child restraints, if you could back up one, Kim, I think we hopped one too far. So getting to some specific issues about child restraints in EMS, as I've already alluded to, when you take a child restraint designed by some very intelligent engineers to function a certain way in a certain type of impact in a forward-facing seat in a passenger vehicle, and you put it in a non-standard installation, you have no idea what that thing is going to do. So essentially, if you choose to do that, you're basically conducting an independent test program, and the child you put in that is now a test pilot in an unsanctioned scientific experiment. So, you know, sometimes you may have to do that. It may be the best alternative, but you need to be aware that what you're doing has no guarantee of successfully and safely securing that child. One of the problems we run into in ambulances is there's not a lot of storage space. So if people do have some type of child restraint on the ambulance, it may not encompass all sizes of children. The most common ambulance child restraints are like 20 to 40, 20 to 50 pounds, and quite often ambulances don't have the ability to secure infants or children that are too large for the restraint that they have, but are too small to go under the adult restraints, the adult belt system. And a lot of these devices are designed to be used on the ambulance cot. So that's fine, but if the child you're transporting is a passenger, meaning that maybe mom or dad or a sibling are the primary patients, and they're going to be on the cot, these devices won't be able to be used in that vehicle. So that's going to entail getting another vehicle to transport the child. Next slide, please. Also, you should be aware that most EMS providers don't have a lot of training on passenger car child restraints. We have a lot of training on transporting children in ambulances when they're our primary patient, but not a lot of training on how to successfully and safely secure passenger car restraints. Now, some people that have children obviously understand how these things work, but the kind of training you get as a child passenger safety tech is typically not included in EMT or paramedic training. So this makes it very easy to incorrectly install child restraints. And even when you do your best to read the instructions and follow the instructions to install them safely, it may be difficult. So a good example is a typical convertible seat that has 2 belt tabs, forward-facing and rear-facing, and each of those belt tabs are clearly marked with stickers and labeling on the seat. So let's say I'm trying to secure a child, mom's on the cot, and I'm trying to secure her 2-year-old in her child restraint in the back of the vehicle. So I decide to put this in that rear-facing adult seat you see down the lower right-hand side. So I look at this thing and I'm trying to figure out how to use it, and I see that there's a label on there that says for rear-facing use, put the belt through here. So I put this thing in the seat and I go, well, it's facing to the rear, so I'm going to use that belt path. And I take that lap belt off that ambulance seat and I run it through that rear-facing belt path. What I've just done is install the seat backwards without meaning to. And as soon as you step on the gas, this thing is likely to flip forward, and that child's head is going to impact the top bar of the ambulance cot. And I actually got a phone call from an ambulance service that had this exact same thing happen, and they were very distraught in trying to figure out what their options were for the future. So very easy to install incorrectly. It's also time-consuming. So if you have a primary patient who is not this child, they're going to get most of the attention while they're being stabilized and ready for transport. This child is going to get belted in whichever way you can figure out as quickly as possible. So again, really increases the likelihood of an incorrect installation of the child restraint. And any of these things that are done exposes the agency and the provider to civil liability because you're not going to be following the instructions of the manufacturer, and you're going to be guilty of misusing that child restraint. Next slide, please. So if there's no correct CR available, what are the EMS options? Well, you can delay transport and wait for another ambulance. So you can use the CRs that you have that are required to go on the cot, for instance. Some EMS systems have different types of police vehicles, fire administration, battalion chief vehicles that are capable of transporting CRs, and folks have some training. So you can wait on the scene, or you can leave the child on scene with another provider until that vehicle arrives. If you feel like you have to go or you don't have those resources, then you have to figure out how to restrain the child using an incorrect child restraint or somehow using the adult belts. Or unfortunately, what happens sometimes is people hold the child in an adult's arms. And that is the one thing that should never be done. This is a screenshot below here from a video that NHTSA produced. It's on their website. And it shows what happens when an adult tries to hold an infant in a 30-mile-an-hour collision. So this child that maybe weighs 20 pounds suddenly is going to weigh 400 pounds. And it doesn't matter how strong you are, you cannot safely secure a child by holding him in somebody's arms. And so at the end of my section here, I'm going to turn things over to Michelle.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. We're going to start out by talking about a case study of a young man that we recently cared for at Riley Hospital. He was involved in an ambulance crash while being transported to the hospital for his weekly dialysis. He received dialysis treatment every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and made the about an hour-and-a-half trip from his home to the hospital and back, like I said, 3 times a week. On this particular day, the ambulance hit black ice and it rolled several times. He sustained serious injuries, including a cervical fracture, several broken ribs, and some contusions. He's a 21-year-old patient, I should say, but he weighed less than 50 pounds, and that's due to his growth retardation due to his chronic renal failure. He was secured to the ambulance cot with the cot safety belts crisscrossed in a crisscross configuration. Next slide, please. He submarined underneath the straps and was hanging kind of head down from the ambulance cot. The projectiles that were throughout the ambulance flew everywhere when in the back compartment when the crash occurred. Both the driver and the EMS attendant, he was in the back of the ambulance, of course, were treated and released with minor bumps and bruises. Okay, next slide. So the patient was transferred to another ambulance and then transported to Riley Hospital, for treatment of his injuries. Next slide. I was consulted to see the child or the young man before he would be discharged from the hospital to develop a safe plan for him to be transported by ambulance. He was required, due to his cervical fracture, to wear a C-collar at all times, and I needed to get any restrictions from his neurosurgeon on about how he could be positioned for transport. She did clear him and said that his only requirement was that he wear the C-collar at all times. So we loaned the EMS company a safeguard transport for them to use to transport this young man back and forth to the hospital for his dialysis treatment until they could get the appropriate devices and to train their staff, which they agreed to do. Then after we had worked out the plan, we documented that in the medical record so everyone would be aware of that, and we would have a history of what the recommendation and the plan was going forward. They did order 2 safeguard transport devices and, as I said, agreed to train their staff on the proper use of the restraint. When we were working with this company to make sure this child would be transported safely in the future, I found it interesting that one of the EMS managers I spoke to mentioned that they had used the safeguard transport before for pediatric patients, but they weren't using it currently because it was not required by law in the state of Indiana. And they did transport within some other states near Indiana that it was required by law, and so patients that were transported into those states, they did use the device. So I guess we in Indiana need to start working on getting it required by law to transport these children appropriately in the back of the ambulance. Next picture, please. Okay, so we have some pictures here. On the far left, it shows the patient on the safeguard transport with his head slightly elevated, and you can see he has the cervical collar on, he has the 5-point harness, it's tightened and secured. There is the lower safety belt on the cot that is secured over his pelvis, and the restraint device is secured to the cot as instructed by the manufacturer. In the middle picture, the EMS providers are loading the cot into the back of the ambulance head first, and the restraint device, of course, is secured to the cot, and then they secure the cot within the cot mount, which is what the third picture on the far right is showing. Next slide, please. So you can see from this case study where this young man was injured, and he suffered quite a bit of pain from those broken ribs as he was healing. It's important to have guidelines on the safe transport of children in ambulances. So today we wanted to share with you the best practice recommendations from NHTSA on the safe transportation of children in emergency ground ambulances. This was published in September of 2012, and there was a group of representatives from various organizations as well as federal agencies that made up the working group membership. And they completed a literature review on the current practices for transporting children, which included the background of pediatric transport, ambulance safety issues, which Kevin talked about, existing guidelines, as well as current practice and outcomes and safety research. Next slide, please. The goal of the working group was to develop recommendations to make the first principle to make everything as safe as possible. 3 guiding principles were to prevent ejection, forward motion, to secure the torso, and to protect the head, neck, and spine. Next slide. So here you see that the recommendations were divided into 5 categories based on the child. So the first category is a child that is not injured and is not ill. Then we have children who could be ill or injured and whose condition does not require continuous monitoring or intervention. Third, we have a child whose condition does require continuous or intensive monitoring or interventions. And then we have the child whose condition requires spinal immobilization or lying flat. And last but not least, a child or children that require transport as part of a multiple patient transport. So we're going to talk about each one of these situations or categories of pediatric transport. Next slide. Okay, so if you think about it, you have to consider when you're making your decision on how to transport the child, why the child is being transported, if they're medically stable or not, and what seating positions or cots are available, the locations for the restraint, as well as the type of restraints that are available. Needless to say, this takes some advanced planning and training on the part of the EMS provider. So the point I would like to make, if you have a child, first of all, that is not injured or ill, is a sibling of a child that is being injured or a parent might be the one that is being transported. It is really important that no one transports the child in the arms or the lap of an adult. And it's important for this to be stated clearly in the policy of the hospital or their EMS provider, so that the people doing the transport have that they can fall back on, that they're following the best practice standards which are documented in the policy, and they will be able to tell the family that we have to find another way to transport this child. We're not allowed to transport this child in an unsafe manner. If there is no other vehicle available with a safe car seat or restraint device, then we have to think about some other things. The first thing we want to do is consider using an integrated child restraint, like Kevin mentioned earlier, whenever possible. We have to think about the fact, though, if we utilize one of the integrated seats in the back of the vehicle, we're taking away a seating position that does have a seat belt that a person that is working in the back of the ambulance could be using during the transport. And within the last couple of years here in Indianapolis, there was a transport company that had a crash, and a person in a passenger vehicle ran a red light and hit them. It was a side impact crash, and both of the providers in the back of the ambulance were not restrained, and they were both young men that were killed in that car crash. So I'm very passionate about trying to make sure that all of the occupants are restrained safely whenever possible. Of course, as Kevin has said, many times that's not the case in the back of the ambulance if they are working and taking care of the patient that is being transported. We want to make sure that we never install a rear-facing car seat, as he pointed out, on a captain's chair that's facing the back of the ambulance. Of course, if we do that, then the car seat would actually be oriented so that it would be facing forward in the vehicle. And we also never want to install a car seat on a side-facing seat, as we discussed. Using a restraint in this way, the frontal crash, the severity of that frontal crash would be applied, that impact would be applied to the child in the side-facing, on the side-facing seat in the car seat, and they would be less protected, of course, in the side-facing orientation than they would in the rear-facing orientation. And for that reason, car seat manufacturers prohibit the use of car seats to be restrained on a seat that faces the interior of the back of the ambulance or a vehicle, as the people on the call that are technicians know. Okay, next slide, please. So we have the next category would be children that are ill or injured, whether they're receiving continuous monitoring or not. We need to try whenever possible to transport them in the appropriate size child restraint that complies with the pulse and injury criteria of Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 213 and Ambulance Standard J3026. We need to determine where the restraint will be used and how it will be secured. Okay, next slide. For children that require spinal immobilization, we need to secure the child to the spine board. Then we need to secure the spine board to the cot. We want to put the child in the ambulance head first, and we want to use a tether at the foot if at all possible and available. You're going to secure the spine board to the cot by using 3 horizontal restraints across the torso and a vertical restraint across each shoulder when the child is required to lie flat on the cot. or on the spine board on the cot, excuse me. Okay, next slide. So the next thing we want to talk about is for multiple patient transports. This can be multiple children, adults and children, a newborn and a mother who's just given birth at home. We need to think about all of the people that need to be transported, what the requirements are for each one to be safely transported, which of course depends on the age and size of the children. And we want to make an assessment, and if you need to call for more ambulance backup, you should do that as soon as possible. One of the things that's important is that under no circumstances should we allow a mother to hold the newborn on the cot. I have participated in teaching the training curriculum for the pediatric transport of children in non-emergent transport situations, and the feedback I've gotten from a lot of the people who work in the back of the ambulance is that they get called frequently for mothers that unexpectedly give birth at home, and this is oftentimes in rural communities where they send out one ambulance, they pick up the mother, she's on the cot, and she's holding the child in her arms. So that is a practice that should never be done. It is not safe, and we are risking that newborn's life. So we need to have a plan in place for those type of calls because we know that we're going to get those. So that's going to require some planning, and we also need to incorporate information on that into the policies we develop and train our staff so that they know when they get those calls what they should be doing to assess that situation and make the best decision they can based on the situation. They need guidance in that area. Okay, next slide. Okay, so when looking at NHTSA's best practice recommendations, there in that document, they outline in Appendix C some criteria that should correlate to the safety of the child restraint system that is being considered. So although we have category A through D, they're from best to worst options, I want you to realize that even the worst options from category D are better than transporting a child unrestrained or being held in the arms of an adult. So that's something that you want to make sure that you understand. A is the best, but if you don't have A, B, or C, D is better than holding a child. So next slide, please. Okay. First of all, we're going to talk briefly about, we're going to talk briefly about car seats or restraint devices that are designed specifically for use in the ambulance compartment and are crash tested to meet the pulse and injury criteria of VMSS 213 and Ambulance Standard J3026. And next slide. The first thing, as we mentioned, is the integrated child restraint. So here is a picture of a little boy, and he is sitting on the chair, the captain's chair. It has an integrated child restraint that can be used usually for children 20 to 40 pounds. And this is your first choice for a child that is not injured or ill. It's easy to use. It's readily available. The EMS personnel can secure the child in the integrated seat more quickly. One thing I do want to stress is that you must follow the manufacturer's guidelines for the minimum and maximum heights and weights whenever you're using an integrated seat for a child in the back of an ambulance. Next slide. Okay. Here is another example from category A. It's an integrated seat. It is the Guardian safety seat. It has a 5-point harness, and it has that 5-point harness for children from 23 to 85 pounds whose height is not greater than 56 inches. It's kind of hard to see here, but where those red tabs are at the top, that is, when you pull that down, it is a cross harness for adults that are oriented or positioned in the captain's seat facing the back of the ambulance. And that, if you remember at the beginning of the presentation, that was the seat that Kevin was sitting in and was restrained with those seat belts. Let's see. Next slide, please. One thing that is unique to this seat is that it has an infant seat that would be oriented rear-facing in the compartment of the seat. So we know that infants require extra head and neck support, and this 5-point harness is for infants from 5 to 22 pounds. It also automatically adjusts to the proper shoulder height as the harness is tightened. And what you do is you take the child and adult back section out, as well as the seat cushions. You remove those and you store them, and you can see it at there to the right of the seat. And the infant seat is pulled out from the storage compartment and it's locked into place. And when you lock it into place, it is automatically positioned at the correct angle for transport. I think this is a very good example of how a mother and a newborn could be transported safely in the back of an ambulance with the mother on the cot and the newborn safely strapped in the car seat. Kevin, is there anything else you would like to add about that seat that I might have forgotten?
No, I think you did great.
Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. This is another seat, or restraint, excuse me, in the category A. You've already seen it. It's the Safeguard Transport, and it is designed for children from 22 to 100 pounds. And you can put either a patient that you're treating or a passenger on the ambulance cot. This was developed in collaboration with Riley Hospital. Next slide. And you can see that it's mounted on the cot here. For children that are 22 to 40 pounds, it can be used with the cot at an angle at 70 degrees or 45 degrees. For children that are bigger, from 40 to 100 pounds, you can use it with the cot back angle at 70 degrees or completely flat. And as it's noted here, it is not to be used for a child that may have a potential spinal cord injury. Next slide. Okay, we're going to move on to category B. And here you see a convertible car seat. Of course, a convertible car seat is a seat that has a forward-facing belt path and a rear-facing belt path, because when the child outgrows it in the rear-facing position, it can be converted to forward-facing. And category B, as we said earlier, is not designed for ambulance use, but it meets FMVSS 213 and is tested in an independent study. So the results were published in 2001 from the Crash Protection for Children in Ambulances by Dr. Bull, Weber, Talty, and Maneri. And it results from that study and that publication say that the convertible car seat can be attached to the ambulance cot, as I said, with one cot strapped through the forward-facing belt path and one through the rear. And the car seat is secured to the cot and facing the rear of the ambulance. The crash testing was done at 30 miles per hour, and they used the infant and the 3-year-old and 6-year-old crash dummies. Okay, next slide. In 2001, the article I just mentioned was published, and in it mentions that the cot back should be elevated, and the back of the car seat should be secured up against the back of the cot with the side rails in the down position when transporting a child in the convertible seat secured to the cot. Okay, next slide. We've got the guidelines for installing the convertible seat. I should say that the seat that was tested was a 5 to 40 pound convertible car seat with a maximum height of 40 inches, had a 5-point internal harness, and you can see here there's an example of a seat that is secured on the cot, and the only thing I would say is that before the child was actually transported, you would want to drop that side rail. And as I said earlier, you have to remember not to exceed the weight and height that is allowed by the manufacturer based on the requirements for that specific seat that you would be using. Okay, next slide. And this is just a drawing of a child on the cot in a convertible seat, and just want to reiterate that you can't use a rear-facing seat only, well, at least if it hasn't been crash tested, it only has one belt path, and so that's why it would not fall into category B. The convertible car seat is the only type of car seat that would fall into category B of the recommendations in the appendix. Next slide. Okay, just briefly, I want to mention that this is a Dream Ride SE car bed that's manufactured by Costco. It's tested for infants from 5 to 20 pounds and used for infants that have to lie prone or supine when transported because they're unable to tolerate transportation in a semi-reclined position due to their medical condition. The doctor is going to order this car bed and instruct the nurse, the technician, the caregiver on how the infant should be positioned, whether supine or prone, based on their medical needs. I just want to say that someone with experience using the Dream Ride car bed and an understanding of how the car bed must be secured onto the ambulance cot should secure the car bed and be involved in the transportation. This is probably rarely needed, but it was crash tested. I do need to say, and it says here on the slide, that you have to use two cot belts, which is not normally the case when you're using this in a passenger vehicle. So it is very important that the person that is using this device has a good understanding of how it has to be used in the ambulance compartment. And this is, like I said, rarely used, but it's good to know that there is a way that we can transport infants if they must lie flat. And this is an example of a transport that obviously we would have to plan in advance to make sure that someone with proper training is available to do the transport. Okay, next slide. This is the PediaPal by Furno, and it is another, it's a restraint device that is for 40 pounds and 40 inches or less for children who can be transported in an upright position. I do need to say it has to be used with a Furno cot only, and it has a 5-point harness and an adjustable back, as the slide says. It is a heavy restraint. It weighs 22 pounds. You would want to contact the manufacturer for information on crash testing results that comply with the pulse and injury criteria for 213 and ambulance standard J3026. All right, next slide. Okay, I would like to say that it is really important that hospitals and EMS providers develop policies on transportation of newborns and children, and should train their transport personnel on the safe transportation of children based on the current recommendations that are available. The National Center for Safe Transportation of Children with Special Health Care Needs, which is affiliated with Riley Hospital for Children and the IU School of Medicine, has a training curriculum which was just revised in 2014 that is available for healthcare providers that are involved in the transportation of children. And I have their website along with the contact information for their program director, Judith Halsey, listed here, where you can contact them for more information regarding training resources that are available for safely transporting children by ambulance. Next slide. Okay. Kevin, would you like to provide some final thoughts?
Sure. So just to recap some of what we talked about, how children are going to be transported needs to be thought about even when the ambulance is being designed and ordered. There's a lot that can be done now with most ambulance manufacturers to make it easier to safely transport children and to safely restrain them in the back of the ambulance. So things like forward-facing seats, that kind of thing, can be incorporated into most ambulance designs as long as that's thought about ahead of time. It's also really important that agencies think about their policies and procedures for transporting kids in ambulances ahead of time. Everybody knows what to do and how to handle situations that may arise. It's really hard to do this extemporaneously when you're in the middle of a call. So people need to think about this and have policies in place ahead of time. Also, the additional training, like Michelle just mentioned, that's available, that's a half-a-day course. And it's really worthwhile to put your EMS personnel through a half-day training on how to correctly use child restraints in the back of the ambulance. So that is available now. It used to be that you had to go through a whole CPST course to get that material. And when you're selecting any type of restraint for the back of the ambulance, you have to pay a little more attention to it than most things. You need to look at the manufacturer's information, maybe contact them, find out what the device is designed for, if it was tested and how it was tested, and then make the best decision for your ambulance situation. And CPS, EMS, the state and federal regulatory industries, everybody needs to work together to improve the awareness of the issues of transporting children in ambulances, and just try to come together to bring all of their resources. The local CPS techs in a community have a great deal of information that most of us in EMS can use, but sometimes it seems like we really get together and share that information. So the final thing would be that it is possible to safely restrain children in ambulances with a little forethought and planning and a little education. So that's all I have. Michelle, anything else you care to add?
I don't think so. Kim, do we have time for some questions?
We do. We have just a little bit of time. It was a wonderful presentation that each of you provided. One of the questions from Thule was that can you turn the attendant seat around, that many of them do forward face. Would you be in compliance then with putting a rear-facing seat on a situation where you can turn that attendant seat around?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, so if you have a seat in the back of the ambulance compartment that will face forward, as long as you can secure the child restraint in the correct way, meaning that you've got a way to adequately lock it on there, because most of these ambulance seats are not going to have anything like a latch system. So you're going to have to use the existing belts that are there. You might have to use a locking clip or something else if they aren't lockable retractors. But as long as you can do that, then it's reasonable to expect that that child restraint will perform the way the manufacturer intended. But the other thing you have to think about is a lot of the captain's chairs that are rear-facing are up against a bulkhead. So even if you can turn them around, if there's room to do that, you have to look at how much room is going to be in front of that child's seat and what's going to happen to the child's legs and potentially their head when there is the excursion that inevitably happens during a forward-facing collision. So as long as you take that into account, that's something that can be done.
Okay, very good. I believe this question is probably from Michelle. This is from Michael, and who would like to know, when talking about securing the patient to a spine board, are the 3 horizontal straps and the 2 vertical straps over the shoulders for both the spine board and the cot, or just the cot?
That we're talking about this. Kevin, can you clarify that? I'm not sure I understand exactly what he means.
Yeah, and I'm not sure either. I think the moral of the story is that typical ambulance cot restraints, even that have the over-the-shoulder straps, allow enough movement to where the patient's head is going to become, going to move substantially over the front of that cot. And that's where a device like the Safeguard Transport that has a 5-point harness is so helpful, because it really reduces that excursion. So again, you have to work with what you have in the ambulance. And I think the moral is the spine board needs to be secured in all of the axes. So lateral movement, front and back movement, it needs to be attached as securely as possible to the cot. And then depending on how that patient is put on the spine board is going to dictate their ability to move. So for instance, if you use like a spider strap that does a pretty good job of holding people on the spine board, it may be a problem and not be a problem. If you just have some lateral belts and some over-the-shoulder belts that are attached to the cot, they may still have too much movement. And I apologize, it's hard to answer that exactly because it really depends on what you have to work with. But I think that's the moral of the story at least.
Again, I'm going to go back to this other slide. If there are specific questions that kind of fell out of the realm of what we covered today, I would suggest contacting either of the speakers through their email system, and I'm sure they'll be happy to get back to you with referrals or answer the question as best they can. So again, thank you so much everyone for participating. Kevin, Michelle, thank you so much. We really appreciate you sharing all this information.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you guys very much for your time and attention. Really appreciate it.
Take care, everyone.